In 1768, the agricultural reformer Arthur Young undertook a 6-month tour through the north of England, an account of which he published in 4 volumes in 1770. In addition to recording progress in drainage, crop rotation, and the cultivation of turnips, he took note of other improvements. And when he visited Wentworth Woodhouse in Yorkshire, the seat of the second Marquis of Rockingham, then head of the opposition, that great house was being enlarged and embellished. And the scagliola columns of the great marble hall, which you now see, were being polished, and marble copies of famous antique statues, commissioned by the Marquis on his grand tour, were waiting to occupy the niches. And you can see 2 of them there today, the Medici Venus and the Apollino of the Tribuna in Florence. Young, like all educated Europeans at this date, would have been aware of how little was known of the paintings of antiquity. He would have known that the Venus Anadyomene, the masterpiece of the great Greek painter Apelles, depicting Aphrodite emerging from the sea, which Pliny had seen in the temple of Julius Caesar in Rome, and which modern artists had dreamt of recreating, had been lost forever. But he would also have heard that astonishing discoveries had been made near Naples, first in the ancient city of Herculaneum, and later in that of Pompeii, which had been buried under the lava and the ash in AD 79. Visitors who obtained passes permitting them to visit the Royal Museum of Portici, where these discoveries were displayed, were especially impressed by the small figures painted as if floating in the air against a plain background, usually black, but occasionally red. Here's one of them on the left of the screen. They were engraved, often in actual size, they're less than a foot high, in the folio volumes of the Antiquity di Ercolano dedicated to the paintings. These volumes were printed in 1757, 1760, 1762, and 1765. The scholarly captions praise the mastery of drawing, the sweetness of painting, the lightness of pose, confining to footnotes speculations as to what the figures represented. Some were thought to be allegories, most of them bacchantes or ballerinas, and perhaps lascivious dancers and waitresses at Roman feasts. These volumes were not at first available commercially, but only by presentation, which delayed the impact of these discoveries. Thanks to the munificent hospitality of his host, Young was able to browse in the library at Wentworth Woodhouse and found there what must have been one of the very few copies of these great folios, the Antiquity di Ercolano, then to be found in Britain. Turning to the engraving by Filippo Morgan after a drawing by Camillo Pederni on page 99 in the first volume devoted to the paintings, he found, and this is what he was looking at on the left, he found an half-naked woman hanging in the air, the turn of the arms holding the drapery inimitably graceful, the beauty of the face and body exquisite, the drapery exceeding fine, displaying the form of the limbs through it in the happiest manner. The whole range of painting can exhibit nothing so astonishingly elegant as this attitude. Generally, it was the single figures that impressed Young most. The engraving on page 129 of the same volume, for example, he considered to be one of the finest attitudes in the world. that the paintings in question, although damaged, are in fact wonderfully fresh, considering their age. But Young's adjectives, inimitably exquisite, exceeding, happiest, astonishing, finest, are surely influenced by their miraculous survival, as well as their intrinsic merits. They had something of the glamour of relics, and it is always strangely moving, as well as impressive, to discover something quite modern in something very ancient. Young's account is the earliest known to me of these paintings in the English language. The enthusiasm was perhaps somewhat conditioned by what he had not seen, for despite his reference to the whole range of painting, Young had not then travelled on the continent, and had no knowledge, for example, of the sensational airborne figures painted by Tiepolo or modelled in stucco by Sir Potter, which you see on the screen now. What he did certainly know, albeit at second hand, was Guido Reni's Fresco of Aurora, painted for Cardinal Borghese in 1613-14, which had become, in the 18th century, one of the most admired of all modern works of art, described by Young's brother-in-law, Charles Burney, in 1770 as perhaps the most pleasing and poetical picture in the universe. Well, Burney had been to the continent. They hadn't actually been to the universe, but this is probably the most copied Italian painting in Britain. Although I am actually illustrating the famous engraving of it by Raphael Morgan of 1787. Admiration of Guido's graceful female figures flying through the sky and lightly tripping over the clouds would certainly have predisposed Young, even if only unconsciously, in favour of these engravings of the ancient murals of dancers. It was their abstraction, though, from any setting that seems to have specially appealed to him, and that is something found in the paintings of horses made by Stubbs for Wentworth Woodhouse at a slightly earlier date. We may speculate on the works of art from which the Herculaneum dancers were derived. Agate cameos were rightly identified as a possible source at an early stage, and that was on account of the black background. But only a few of the paintings, actually including the last one we've looked at, which is now on the left of the screen, only a few of the paintings have an elegant silhouette, such as is usually found in cameos. And there seems also to be a reflection of the small sculptures of the Hellenistic world, of which the most remarkable, now known, is the bronze veiled dancer in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, thought to come from Alexandria, now in the middle of the screen. And no ancient sculpture is conceived more completely in the round, or more completely represents a body in movement. The draperies are stretched across and against the body, and in several layers, one of which is for the mask, covering most of the face. Most of the dancing figures of this kind are of terracotta, and some of those, I'm illustrating a couple in the Getty Museum, are also conceived entirely in the round and are almost as enchanting. But none of these small sculptures seems to have been known in the 18th century, at least none of this quality. Young's response may have been a shade naive, but enthusiasm for the paintings of dancers was widespread, and they can be found copied and adapted in the decorative arts and as architectural ornaments all over Europe. And on the screen now you see the painting that most excited Young. You see the print after it, which is really what he saw, of course. Then you see below some of the Neapolitan porcelain in which the same figure appears in different colours. We find them, it's perhaps not surprising they're found on Neapolitan porcelain, but they perhaps prompted the performances given at special evening entertainments by Emma Hart, the young mistress and later the wife of Sir William Hamilton, British ambassador in Naples. These entertainments were for visitors to the city, most of whom would already have previously marvelled at the mural paintings in the Museum of Portici. On the 16th of March, 1787, Goethe, after watching two such intoxicating performances, wrote, "She is very handsome and of a beautiful figure. The old knight has made for her a Greek costume, which becomes her extremely. Dressed in this, and letting her hair loose, and taking a couple of shawls, she exhibits every possible variety of posture, expression, and look, so that at the last, the spectator almost fancies it is a dream. And that the Herculaneum dancers were a major inspiration for these performances is suggested by Goethe's discovery, when he returned to Naples later that year, that Hamilton had had a black box made with a frame around its opening, in which Emma had posed in a stationary attitude, intended to recall the ancient paintings of Pompeii. The best record of Emma's attitudes is supplied by the drawings copied after Nature at Naples, and with permission dedicated to the Right Honourable Sir William Hamilton. Drawings made by Frederick Rayberg and engraved by Tommaso Pirelli in 1794, and you see one of them on the right of the screen. Her repertoire had been much extended by that date, but the pose she adopted in the sixth plate, the one you're looking at, is very close to that of the ancient dancers in these paintings. These dancers were rapidly adapted as low reliefs, some of which were sent from London to Lord Lansdowne in London, and aftercasts of these were made for Josiah Wedgwood in the early 1770s and served as models for roundels in a variety of ceramic bodies. But that they were of inspiration to Emma Hart prepares us for the much more surprising possibility that they helped Antonio Canova to invent some of his most beautiful freestanding statues. Paintings of in tempera of sprightly female figures wearing superfine drapery against a black background, which adorn Canova's house in Pozzagno, are obviously imitations of the Portici murals. They seem to have been made for Canova, some believe them to have been made by Canova, around 1800. But they are based on sketches made by him a decade earlier. One of those sketches is on the right of the screen. There can be no doubt that his three statues of dancers, famous statues of dancers, one in Berlin is on the right, and one of the tempera paintings on the left. There can be no doubt that his statues of dancers, there are three of them, executed in the early 19th century, follow these pictorial inventions. But the first of what it is tempting to describe as Canova's Herculaneum sculptures was surely his Hebe, the first idea for which can be dated to 1791, and the first version of which was carved in 1795-6. There are two later versions, and I'm showing you on the screen. In one case, the figure is on a steep bank, and in the other case, perhaps less happily, in the clouds. An obviously appealing aspect of Canova's Hebe is the drapery, exceeding fine, displaying the form of the limbs through it in the happiest manner, to repeat Young's words. Showing the legs through drapery, at the action, a fine waitress's swift service would be emphasized thereby. Hebe appears to be pouring from one vessel to another while in motion, which might seem contrived, yet somehow provides the perfect hint of angelic prowess, and since it is an action generally associated with the virtue of temperance, helps to remove the maiden from any association with the alcoholic excesses that Olympian banquets may have entailed. This effect of transparency had in fact long been admired in antique sculpture, most famously in the legs of the colossal Flora. Just focus on the legs on the left of the screen. The image on the right gives you a sense of scale, and you'll see those legs, as it were, almost as if they're underwater, under clear water. The colossal Flora had been restored for the Farnese by Guglielmo della Porta in the 1550s. And during the 1790s, it was again under restoration in Rome, and so very, very much, I suppose, on Canova's mind. The exquisite low relief carving of the fine garment drawn tightly over the back of the nymph with a shell, in the version of that ancient sculpture in the Borghese collection, now in the Louvre, which you see on the screen, represented another ideal. Canova was also certainly familiar with the sculpture to be seen both in Venice and in Naples by Antonio Corradini, who was especially admired for carving transparent marble veils, through which not only the form, but even the expression of a face was legible. You see one of his greatest works now in the Chorus Sonica on the left of the screen. The word veil introduces the topic of drapery as metaphor, a form of withdrawal, or indeed enticement, a sign of mourning, or indeed of death. Such powerful ideas that one hesitates to advance the possible origin of this sort of practice in the need to drape clay models with a damp cloth to delay their drying. The veiled head, incidentally, seems to have been known in antique sculpture, and I'm showing you a marble head in the Metropolitan Museum, although I'm not suggesting that Corradini knew this, or necessarily anything quite like it. Such drapery is sometimes referred to as wet drapery, and the movement of the folds sometimes resembles running water, as in the fictive statue of Ceres or Abundance, painted by Giulio Romano when in Raphael's studio. Painting is now in the Louvre, and clearly modelled on a variant, probably a damaged variant, of the Venus Genetrix, which I show you on the right, known in many versions. This is the finest, also in the Louvre. And occasionally, in ancient Greek sculptures, most notably, and perhaps not entirely agreeably, in the Nereids of the early 4th century BC in the British Museum, the drapery really does seem wet and seems to be intended to show that the figures belonged to the sea. But on the whole, it is the air, or at least the wind, which is suggested, if not exactly represented, by drapery of this kind. Hebe moves swiftly. The most famous representative of Nike, the winged victory of Samothrace on the Escalier d'Arrou of the Louvre, and indeed the little Spirit of Speed riding on the Rolls Royce, move faster still. The great art critic, Charles Blanc, in his Grammaire des Arts du Dessin, which, by the way, is now available in this very useful paperback with an admirable introduction by Claire Barbillon, which I strongly recommend to you. Charles Blanc, in his Grammaire des Arts du Dessin, emphasized that some sort of freedom and detachment is essential to drapery of this kind. And he quotes Molière on a painting by Mignard, in which our eyes can detect the nude form below, but not see everything, and where the drapery doesn't adhere, but follows the graces it covers. And without clinging, caresses and embraces, qui ne s'y colle point, mais en suivre la grâce, et sans le serrer trop, le caresse et l'embrasse. Returning to Canova's Hebe, as she moves forward, we should compare it with Thorvaldsen's stationary Hebe, first modelled in 1805. And this is a comparison, obviously, that Thorvaldsen intended, since his figure was a criticism of the sprightly and spirited style so often preferred by Canova. Statues, he implied, should be more static, and maidens more pensive and modest. A major difference is, of course, that the sense of touch, the urge to caress with the eye, is deliberately inhibited by the drapery of the latter work. As mentioned in the first of these lectures last week, the frieze of saints and martyrs painted by Hippolyte Flandra in the Parisian church of Saint Vincent de Paul was likened by Gautier to the Panathenaic procession on the Parthenon frieze, and probably in particular to the slab which is in the Louvre, of which Charles Blanc observed, "These draperies with their regular folds are untouched by any hand. No breeze has yet disordered them. Passions have not yet ruffled them. Les émotions de la vie ne les ont pas froissées. They are chaste in their order and in their solemnity, chaste dans leur régularité et solennelle." This is to move almost into the realm of abstract or musical analysis, but to suggest, and often no more than suggestion would be reputable, to suggest moral qualities as well as poetical echoes is something that this lecture hopes to encourage. It seems appropriate to turn to the architectural and the monumental, the block statues, as archaeologists term them, of ancient Egypt. And I'm showing you one on the left, and one of many in the British Museum, but also a detail from Zoffany's painting of the Tribuna in Florence. These statues were known in the 18th century. The block statues are the most obvious sculptures of this character. The chief function of the drapery is here to unite the limbs and simplify the forms. But before we conclude that the ancient Egyptians thought of such figures as austerely geometric, we should reflect that they seem to have known no other form of figure carved in stone. It is generally agreed that the ancient Greeks must have had some knowledge of Egyptian sculpture, but the local tradition from which their archaic male and female figures emerge was one of wood carving. And it is a trunk-like form which the female korai retain. Together sometimes with the technique of a separate dowled projection for the forearm. And the drapery emphasizes this cylindrical character, whereas their nude male brothers more often contain some recollection of the marble block. Corée number 619 in the Acropolis Museum, which you see on the left of the screen, is one example of this, and the Corée made of marble from Samos, now in the Louvre, is another. That's on the right. This combination of conservative, or at least retrospective characteristics with incessant novel refinements, the former tendency perhaps enhancing awareness of the latter, is of course also a feature of Greek temples, which reproduce in stone features of the wooden buildings which they replaced. And statues should not be thought of as a category entirely separate from architecture. The late 5th century caryatids of the Erechtheium in Athens, of which this splendid example is in the British Museum, certainly recall earlier feminine supports. The column shafts recall the tree trunk supports of the archetypal wooden temple. And it was the Corée, the draped maidens, which were trunk-like. The draped female statues of a somewhat earlier stylistic phase, earlier than this, which I am illustrating now with one of the shattered figures found by Sir Charles Fellows built into a wall in Turkey in 1848. That's on the left. And now in the British Museum. And with the Peplophorus Ludovisi, a fine Roman copy now on view in Palazzo Altas. These are no less truly architectural creations, not because they served any architectural function, but because the folds and divisions of the drapery are now given some of the economy and lucidity that characterizes Doric temple architecture. The broad, clean surfaces, which would have facilitated effective painted decoration, and the naturalism relative to anything of earlier date, may have been the qualities most obviously striking at the time these statues were made. For us, they inevitably seem to be appropriately designated as early classical and as severe as representatives of the severe style, although their creators did not know that something softer or something more classical would soon emerge. In the 17th century, some limited awareness of Egyptian art and of early Greek sculpture was possible to obtain in Rome from Roman copies and from a few genuine fragments in Western Europe. An archaic head, now in the museum in Lyon, had somehow found its way to the south of France from the Perser chute, the dump of smashed statues left in Athens by the Persians in 480 BC, where the rest of the body turned up in the late 19th century. A fine archaic bronze statuette, thought by some to be Etruscan, illustrated in my first lecture, was already in the French royal collection in the 17th century. But these were not of interest then to artists, only to antiquarians. The severe style was perhaps a different matter. The splendid Peplophorus Ludovisi was not among the most admired works in the Ludovisi collection, but it cannot have been ignored there either. The maidens gathered round the well in Poussin's painting of 1648 are deliberately associated with geometrical solids, with cube and sphere, and with architecture, and with vases. Someone with no knowledge of the relevant biblical story of Rebecca might suppose that the subject of the painting was a learned man expounding to the leader of a female community the merits of a new range of beautiful vessels with which they had been supplied. There are 9 vases altogether in the painting, and although the only 2 carried on the head are clearly of metal, some of the others look as if they're fashioned out of stone, in which case the man will need a great deal of eloquence. The theme of the draped woman supporting a vase or a basket became a highly popular theme in 19th century sculpture. Perhaps especially popular in Germany or with German sculptors. And of course, some association of the draped female and the standing column is found in Ingres' painting of Stratonice and Antiochus, described in or featuring in my first lecture. And here it is worth pausing to ask what we mean by drapery. Whatever had been the case in ancient Greece, it is certainly not contemporary dress, nor special costume by Poussin's day, nor surely for the copyists who were employed by the Romans. Charles Blanc not only distinguishes drapery from dress or costume, but observes that drapery is equivalent to the ideal in the figure, that is, an abstraction from common nature. It is likely that this was an orthodox view, although I know of no earlier example of this definition of drapery. It is generally true that we do not often think of what drapery is actually made of, wool, linen, cotton, or silk. But what we are aware of is, of course, its weight. And it is heavy drapery, which will generally be employed when a sculptor wishes to give an architectural or geometric character to it. A series of drawings made by Canova in the 1790s, there are 2 of them, explore how a male figure might be covered with a single massive piece of heavy cloth, such as would emphasize his grief, which was far more commonly represented by female figures, or endow him with some sort of sacerdotal authority. Authority is indeed the quality that most requires the metaphorical support of massive and heavy drapery. And there is no better example of this than Raphael's figure of St. Paul preaching at Athens in the tapestry cartoon, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and belonging, of course, to Her Majesty the Queen. Here, the relationship with architecture is very marked. The figure is raised upon steps, and the upright of the step, the riser, is continued in the vertical folds of the cloak. The arch behind the figure springs from these verticals and mirrors the upswing of the apostle's arms. His eloquent hands are aligned with the powerful staccato block capitals to half a dozen stern stone piers. Despite the setting in ancient Athens, Raphael's St. Paul does not recall antique sculpture so much as the style of earlier Florentine artists, and most obviously the style of Masaccio more than 50 years before in the Brancacci Chapel, which is on the right now. There are other instances of this sort of stylistic return. One of the most extraordinary drawings by the young Michelangelo, now on the right, is best explained in this way. In this case, the head that emerges from the monolithic drapery is as bizarre in proportion as it is ferocious in expression, square in shape with a flattened nose, like the artist's own nose, and unlike that of the companion figure. Later than Masaccio, but earlier than Raphael and Michelangelo, there is Pirodello Francesca's fresco of the risen Christ in Censor. Christ is a vertical force, contrasted with the horizontal mouldings of the tomb from which he rises. His staff and the muscles of his torso and his raised leg emphasize this vertical. But both arms and drapery folds supply rising diagonals to contrast with those of the slumbering guards below. His head and shoulders rise as the sun rises above the horizon, through which the trees to right and left also break. The geometry of drapery can sometimes find support from what we may call quasi-architectural interior cloth, the massive bed hangings behind the wooden platform, upon which, cross-legged, the Virgin is seated in Poussin's painting of the Annunciation in the National Gallery in London. To provide an example, the opening does not only provide a dark foil for the angel Gabriel's signing hands, but a triangular opening in a painting full of diagonals, the open arms of the Virgin, the open book before her, the open wings of the dove above her. Poussin was interested in the primitive church, in the world before the chair and the table, and in the geometry of elementary shapes and solids. But this is not only a world of crystalline angularity. There is softness, the softness of the double line of overfolds in Gabriel's garment, which puddles behind him. In the 19th century, the painter most attracted by the austere ideals of the primitive church was Hippolyte Flandra, who featured so much in my first lecture. He is now remembered, when he's remembered at all, as a favourite disciple of Ingres, and he is also described by one modern art historian as a church decorator, as if ecclesiastical mural painting was something which no serious artist in the second half of the 19th century engaged. His paintings in the great new Parisian church of Saint Vincent de Paul, described in the first lecture, and the much refurbished old one of Saint-Germain-des-Prés are indeed his greatest achievements. And one of his outstanding successes at the Salon, his Mater Dolorosa of 1845, which you see on the right of the screen now, was destined for a parish church, where it remains today in its neo-Gothic frame. Flandrin took as his starting point the engraving by Marc Antonio of a grieving Virgin Mary with the body of Christ, which is known in two versions, both on the screen. But he removed the rock tomb, shattered tree, also the body of Christ itself, and converted the Virgin Mary from an actor in a tragic narrative to a potent icon of endurance and compassion, mutely appealing to us and displaying in her hands the nails and the crown of thorns. Her dress is radically simplified, as is the landscape with its low horizon, the few features of which are obscured as night falls. A ladder is propped against the far side of the cross, and a cloth, presumably the sling by which the body of Christ was lowered, hangs from one crossbar, its folds continuous with those of her cloak and skirt. Thus, drapery makes possible her identification with the cross behind her, Her figure repeats the arched shape of the canvas, and the curves of her mantle, her head, and her halo compel our attention to her head. Flandra would certainly have known of Raphael's drawings. He may well have known of the very damaged drawing preparatory for these prints. And Flandra would have been familiar with Raphael's practice, followed by his teacher Ang, of making studies of the nude model and then separate studies of drapery, probably arranged over a lay figure. And here's a famous example, fairly early work, of course, by Raphael of this kind. There are hundreds of such drapery studies made in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Maybe a few made in the 20th as well. The examples here are by Marathi on the left, the 17th century, and Overbeck of the early 19th century on the right. Sometimes we can trace an artist's thinking as he modifies the drapery. Edward Poynter, first Slade professor in the University of London and first director of the new Slade School, made possible by Slade's bequest, put his views on this subject into a lecture. Drapery is not merely to serve as a covering to the limbs or to give character through costume, but to add dignity or grace to the figures, to assist their movement by the direction of its folds, and to knit together by broad masses and leading lines the various parts of the composition. Here, I hope, no, that's my. Here is a detail of the furious high priest who condemns St. Stephen to death in a severely damaged fresco painted by Poynter in St. Stephen's Church, South Dulwich. The artist began on the 26th of August, 1872, with a drawing of for the pose made from a young nude model, that's on the left. And on the same day, he made studies for drapery. But in November, he revised the drapery so that it not only added dignity or grace, but assisted in the figure's movement by the direction of its folds. He introduced more movement, more disarray and turbulence caused by the figure's movement and sweeping curves, which would echo those of his arms. He also wanted the raised support hand to cut across the sweeping lines of the headdress, an effect which is somewhat lost in the finished painting by the archaeologically correct character of the vestments. So in this painting, costume must certainly have impeded drapery. The practice of the young Degas, preparing to paint his Semiramis a decade earlier, was little different. For the beautiful crouching handmaiden wearing rose, he made a nude study and an exquisite drapery study, which, however, he chose not to follow exactly, perhaps because its intricacy distracted from the shape of the body beneath and from the main lines of his composition, influenced, incidentally, both by Pirodello Francesca and by Hippolyte Flandra. Artists sometimes made models of the nude figure, which they draped. These tended for obvious reasons to be smaller than the living model or the lay figure. An example which happens to have survived is the clay model made by Frederick Leighton for his painting Simon and Iphigenia of about 1883. Here's the painting, and here is the model of Iphigenia nude, which survived because a bronze cast was made of it by the Royal Academy after Leighton's death. The artist explained that he covered it with real drapery wetted to increase the effect of its fineness in proportion to the small scale of the folds. It's not quite clear what he meant by this, but certainly the wet cloth ensured that the nude body remained clearly defined. But he also said that he did this only for the sake of 10-minute drawings, quick studies, and that the serious study of drapery was then made from the living model or lay figure. This statuette is only 62.5 centimeters long. So one thing that is surely clear is that the exercise would have encouraged the artist to give a broad pattern, a clear rhythm to the drapery, whatever complexities he finally decided upon. There must have been many, many other artists who employed a similar device, and some of these cases are known to us. Goethe mentions in his Italian journey that Tischbein, when making his portrait in 1787, this is the painting now on the screen, which is in the State Museum in Frankfurt, employed a sculptor to make a clay model over which he could cast the drapery, in this case, heavy drapery. This is not so far in date. From Canova's studies of heavy drapery, you see on the left, or of the rediscovery by artists of the grand simplicity of Michelangelo's frescoes of the ancestors of Christ in the dim margins of the vault of the Sistine Chapel. Drapery, once arranged or thrown in the desired pattern, could be fixed if liquid clay, slip, liquid plaster, or size was added to the cloth employed beforehand. This technique was associated by Vasari with Verrocchio and his workshop. A number of very beautiful drawings survive which record such stiffened drapery. Some are in metal point on paper with a coloured ground, such as the one you see on the left, where the lights are brushed on with lead white. Others are painted in grey and brown and white on fine linen, as in the case on the right. And therefore they are studies of linen on linen. The idea must have been to ensure that the folds and breaks seem completely natural, even though they have been encouraged to possess a monumental plasticity with deep hollows. Some can be related to documented sculptures by Verrocchio or to paintings by his pupil, Lorenzo di Credi, and some of them are by Leonardo da Vinci. We do not know how large the draperies set in this way were, but perhaps the drawings are more or less the size of life, and the drapery not much larger than a large handkerchief. The beautiful terracotta statuette of the Virgin and Chuckling Child in the Victorian Albert Museum, recently proposed by Francesco Cagliotti as the work of Leonardo, has drapery remarkably close in character to these drawings, as I think you can see from this comparison. We do not know where or when the technique originated, but it is surely likely that it was an attempt to recapture the monumentality of Masaccio's drapery in paintings made nearly 50 years before. Nor is there any certainty as to how long this practice remained in use, but I suspect that it was quite often revived. It is surely an example of the beneficial cross-fertilization of sculpture and painting that is characteristic of Florentine art in the 15th century, especially. Sculptors had long used stiffened linen for the loincloth of the crucified Christ, carved in wood, and it may be that Verrocchio employed a related technique to make the rather stiff but fluttering jerkin of his boy with a dolphin. In numerous examples discussed so far, the drapery has been too copious to be convenient for most purposes. Clothing, as emblematic of high rank, had always tended to be abundant enough to make it clear that the wearer was not expected to engage in physical labor. Paul may preach, and the high priest may denounce. But the woman with two vases on the extreme left of Poussin's Rebecca at the Well, will have great difficulty not tripping up, especially since neither hand will be free to hitch up her skirt. When Aristotle, in Raphael's School of Athens, moves his book his cloak will tumble to the ground. The bald and bearded sage in yellow among the group of 7 philosophers to the right of him is even more seriously encumbered. Such a huge amount of drapery was also favoured by Annibale Carracci and Carlo Maratta, who counted themselves among Raphael's greatest admirers in the 17th century. And I show you examples of drawings by them on either side of the central portion of the School of Athens. In his notebook, containing drafts, ideas, and drawings for his Royal Academy lectures, Flaxman speculated that when artists began to imitate antique sculpture, they imitated a style of dress with which they were unfamiliar, in consequence of which they often drew their draperies from imagination. And as the general forms were undetermined, so the folds were, of course, unnatural. So it's an interesting theory, and I'm not convinced by it. The first feature of antique drapery to be imitated in Europe was, I think, the overfall. There's no satisfactory English term for this feature of a dress, where bunched fabric is looped over a belt or girdle. One could say overhang, but hardly hang over. It is seen in the attire of angels from quite early in the 15th century, and was thereafter a constant feature of female or angelic dress in painting, but never adopted in actual dress. But it cannot be said to be unnatural. It may, however, be argued that impracticably copious drapery was stimulated by the study of some antique sculpture. It may be possible to distinguish in the drapery which is wound around and falls over the body of the so-called Cleopatra or Ariadne in the Vatican as scarf, shawl, cloak, or sheet. But it is easy to see how such a sculpture, together with the practice of making separate drapery studies, may have encouraged artists to endow drapery with a life of its own, independent of any function as clothing. Thus emancipated, drapery may help to indicate the agonies of Guido Reni's Cleopatra, or the ecstatic inspiration of Domenichino's St. John the Evangelist, shown in these 2 images. Or the desperate penitence of Lebrun's Magdalene in the Louvre. In the latter case, of course, the drapery reveals the wealth and luxury which the Magdalene is renouncing, but there is far more fabric than she can have been wearing. It streams down the architecture, cascades from the table, pools over a cushion in the lower right corner, and the whole painting seems to be about confusion and loosening, shedding, and outpouring. This painting was for 2 centuries one of the most famous on public exhibition in Paris, partly because it was wrongly believed to represent Louise de la Vallière, the mistress of Louis XIV. The large role given to drapery in such a painting fell into disrepute in the last decades of the 18th century, but was revived with a new vigor by Delacroix, as can be seen in his great mural in the Parisian church of Saint-Sulpice, completed in 1861, where Heliodorus is expelled from the temple by 3 angels, one on a grey stallion and the other 2 flying through the building. The flight path of the angel in the centre is marked by the huge curtain or hanging, which is blown out between the massive columns at the top, and by the violet grey cloak floating out behind him. This great arc concludes below the supine villain, from whom the crimson cloak into which he has swept the treasures of the temple falls, or, as it seems, pours and spills over the steps. Flaxman, in expressing his distaste for what we would call the Baroque, continued in the passage I've quoted to observe that some artists have been so absurd as to dress their figures in a parcel of rags of uncertain forms, which produced a distraction of effect, destructive of the form of the human figure. What he had in mind was a figure like Religious Faith by Pierre-Étienne Monod in the Basilica of St. Peter's, or the colossal St. Matthew on the right of the image of the screen now, in the Basilica, sorry, the St. Matthew by Camilla Rusconi in the Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano. Flaxman does in fact specifically mention Rusconi. We need not agree that the drapery here is destructive of the form of the human figure. They both complement and contrast with its heroic articulation. But in the sculpture of Bernini, one can certainly see how the drapery breaks up the body, so that torso and limbs, and indeed one leg and another, seem disjointed. Furthermore, Bernini employs drapery as a theatrical curtain, breaking up the architectural setting, as in the tomb of Pope Alexander VII. And there is a parallel here to the frequent use of massive drapes in the background of state portraits. And a major source is likely to have been the way in which cloth was employed to decorate church interiors for the obsequies of princes or the canonization of saints. In the paintings made by Bernini's protégé, Baciccio, Gauli, as in this detail of the Marys at the tomb in the Fitzwilliam Museum, and in the angels carrying instruments of the Passion carved by his workshop for the Ponte Sant'Angelo, drapery curls around the figures like smoke and flames. A source of inspiration was certainly Correggio. Baciccio was indeed sent by Bernini to Parma to study the extraordinary fresco in the dome of the cathedral, where the foreshortened Virgin with outstretched arms is borne up to heaven amidst drapery, clouds, and the tangled limbs of her angelic escort. The same restless forms distinguish the little Holy Family in the National Gallery, where the Virgin Mary helps to insert her wriggling child's arm into his new jacket. The lovable disequilibrium eventually induces a craving for anatomical structure and compositional architecture. The sculpture of the Parthenon, brought to London by the Earl of Elgin and eventually acquired by the British Museum in 1816, to judge from the testimonies concerning it by artists and connoisseurs given to a parliamentary committee, established to assess its real value, their testimony demonstrates that the least appreciated aspect of the sculpture was the extremely elaborate drapery of the figures that you now see on the screen, the figures from the East Pediment, and especially those believed to represent Aphrodite relaxing in the lap and against the breast of her mother Dione, but which were then thought to be two of the three fates. By the mid-19th century, however, this group was the subject of increasing enthusiasm. The French sculptor Censor made a reconstruction on a reduced scale, of which you see a rather lurid gilded version on the screen. And Ingres considered how he might adapt it within the bolder but sinuous outlines that you see in this small drawing. What is most remarkable about these draperies is the way that they combine the restless rhythms of Correggio with completely secure postures and natural character. Even in their shattered form, we immediately sense a contrast between the stronger, upright mother and the relaxed posture of the supple, younger daughter. It is impossible to believe that all the refinements of this work, and even the subtle contrasts between the intricate folds of the thin chitons and the deeper folds of the heavier mantles across the knees, could be appreciated from ground level. But there can also be little doubt that the fragmentary condition enhanced its metaphorical character. For some scholars, the impression of fluidity prompted the idea that the group symbolized the sea resting in the arms of the earth. It is surely significant that the influence and reputation of the Parthenon sculpture owed much to painters, albeit painters who were also sculptors, George Frederick Watts and Frederick Leighton. And I owe to Liz Bretjohn the striking fact that Watts claimed that it was Titian's drapery, which you've been looking at on the right-hand side of the screen, that enabled him to fully appreciate the Parthenon carvings. And the influence of both is to be found in his Ariadne, as well as in many other works. Leighton followed only a little way behind. His drapery style was modified as he studied the Parthenon. Some of his compositions are of figures sleeping, slumbering, buried in drapery. One would not describe this as wet drapery, but one might describe it as drapery which possessed something of the character of waves breaking over and swirling around smooth, eroded rocks. Leighton's masterpiece of the 1880s, the Captive Andromache, recapitulates much that has been mentioned in this lecture. The figures, for example, were not only studied separately, nude, but probably first painted nude and then draped. In several passages, the drapery recalls, in its rich, crinkly surface, as well as its adhesion to the figure, the drapery of the East Pediment fates, as they were then designated. Leighton was a patron and supporter of younger artists, including Thornycroft, whose sculpture, The Wife of Lot of 1878, Wife of Lot turned not into salt but marble, or about to be, of 1878 was acquired by him, for example. And Thornycroft, in his lecture to the Royal Academy, lamented that the Academy had no casts of these marvellous sculptures. The style spread quickly to North America, where it is superbly represented by the red limestone chimneypiece made for the Vanderbilt mansion by Augustus St. Gaudens in 1881-3, and now to be seen in the Metropolitan Museum. Earlier in this lecture, I quoted Edward Poynter on the uses of drapery, its value adding dignity and grace, assisting in the representation of movement, helping to unify different parts of a composition. He ended this passage with the observation that in the colouring of a picture, it is, of course, invaluable. And indeed, in the figurative painting of Western Europe, from Giotto to Matisse, it is the case that colour is in large part contributed by drapery. We can move from an altarpiece of the 14th century to an easel painting of the late 16th century and find much the same brilliant palette of white, blue, yellow, crimson, and scarlet, almost entirely a construction of the imagination applied to drapery. Colour, of course, enhances the metaphorical character of drapery, so that the crimson cloth beside Heliodorus suggests spilt blood, and the brilliant yellow of Aurora matches the blazing yellow of the dawn sky and the violet grey of the clouds around her. It can also conduct the eye to key elements in a composition. The subject of Solimeno's magnificent canvas, 1710, in the National Gallery in London, is taken from Virgil's Aeneid. Aeneas makes lavish presents to thank Dido, Queen of Carthage, for her hospitality to the Trojans. His beautiful son, Ascanius, in fact Cupid in disguise, greets her. A young lieutenant offers priceless relics of the Trojan royal family, including robes which had been worn by Helen. Dido, in Dryden's great translation of Virgil, with eyes insatiate and tumultuous joy, beholds the presents and admires the boy. The gestures of Aeneas, left and right hand, are not quite enough to give the boy and the gifts an equal emphasis. But the brilliant yellow contrasted with the blues around it achieves the desired result. Leighton's Captive Andromache is a painting of similar size and grandeur, set on a similar stage, and with a similar half-length muscular male nude in the foreground, turning to look at the protagonist. In front of him are travellers, one of whom points her out, no doubt observing that she was once the wife of a great Trojan warrior, Hector. And at the mention of that name, the older woman with her distaff looks up. The diagonals of the receding buildings point to Andromache in the centre of the composition. Hers is the only head against the sky. So her head is in the clouds, heavy cumulus clouds, her thoughts far away, as her eyes fall on the radiant family group lower right. She is completely contrasted by her static and completely closed, tightly wrapped pose. And she is also contrasted in colour with the other women who process to the well, among whom only one gives her any attention. Thank you.